They woke me up on a Tuesday morning in March, and the first thing I saw was not my husband's face. It was a stranger in scrubs, checking a monitor above my head, muttering numbers into a recorder clipped to her collar. I had been asleep, if you could call it that, for 241 days. My mouth was dry as chalk. My arms felt like they belonged to someone else. And when I finally found my voice, the only word I could push out was his name, Edmund. The nurse's face changed in a way I will never forget. A flicker of something she tried to smooth over before I could read it clearly. She told me to rest. She told me the doctor would explain everything. What she did not tell me, what no one told me for 3 more days, was that my husband of 31 years was already in the ground, and that while I lay unconscious in that bed, the people I trusted most had quietly written me out of my own life. Before we go further, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because what happened to me over the following months will make you question how well you really know the people closest to you, and I want you to sit with that question until the very end. My name is Charlotte Pierce, and for most of my adult life I believed I understood exactly where I stood in my family. I met Edmund when I was 26 years old, working as a junior draftsman at a small architectural firm in a city that has since forgotten how small it once was. He was 8 years older, already sketching the outlines of what would become Pierce Architectural Group on the backs of napkins in a diner 2 blocks from my apartment. I did not marry into money. I married into a dream that had not yet been built, and I spent the next 3 decades of my life helping him build it, one contract, one late night, one impossible deadline at a time. By the time I turned 58, Pierce Architectural Group had offices in 4 cities and a reputation that opened doors before we ever knocked on them. People who met us later at galas and fundraisers assumed I was simply the founder's wife, decorative and grateful. They never asked who had negotiated the firm's first major municipal contract, or whose name was quietly listed as co-founder in the original incorporation papers filed 31 years earlier. I let them assume. Edmund never did. I remember one night in particular nearly 20 years into our marriage that has stayed with me more vividly than almost any other memory of that period. We had just lost a municipal contract we had spent 4 months preparing for, a contract that would have secured the firm's finances for the next several years, and I found Edmund sitting alone in his study at nearly 2 in the morning, surrounded by drawings he had reworked a dozen times, convinced the failure was entirely his own. I sat down across from him and told him plainly that we had built this together, that the loss belonged to both of us just as fully as any future success would, and that I was not going anywhere, win or lose. He looked at me for a long moment and said something I have carried with me every day since. He said that whatever happened to the company, whatever happened to either of us, he wanted it understood, formally and permanently, that I was never simply his wife in the eyes of this business. I was his partner in every sense the word could hold. It was that conversation, more than any legal document, that shaped the will we drafted together 15 years later, a will meant to make that private understanding public and permanent, protected against exactly the kind of erosion that time, grief, or opportunism might otherwise bring to bear on it. We had one daughter together, Sophie, born when I was 34, a bright and stubborn girl who grew into a bright and stubborn woman with her father's eye for structure and my refusal to back down from an argument I believed I was right about. Edmund also had a daughter from his first marriage, Vanessa, 12 years older than Sophie, raised mostly by her mother in another state before coming to live with us for her final 2 years of high school. I tried in every way I knew how to make Vanessa feel like she belonged in our home rather than merely tolerated in it. I attended her school plays. I sat through her college applications. I told myself for 20 years that the distance I sometimes felt from her was simply the ordinary friction of a blended family, nothing more sinister than the natural math of loyalty divided between 2 households. I was wrong about a great many things, but I was never more wrong than I was about that. Looking back now, I can identify small warning signs in the weeks before the accident that I did not recognize at the time for what they were. Edmund had begun coming home later than usual, not from the office but from what he described as long walks he needed to clear his head, walks that sometimes stretched past 2 hours on evenings when he complained of feeling unusually tired the next morning. He mentioned once, almost in passing over dinner, that his doctor wanted to run some additional tests on his heart, tests he waved off as routine, the kind of precaution men in their 60s are simply expected to undergo. I did not press him on it, because Edmund had spent 31 years being a private man about his own health, The kind of man who believed that worrying his family unnecessarily was its own small form of selfishness. I have thought many times since about what might have happened differently if I had pushed harder in that moment, if I had insisted on coming to that next appointment with him. I will never know the answer, and I have had to make a kind of peace with that not knowing, because there is no version of grief that survives being weaponized against yourself indefinitely. What I do know, because Sophie eventually pieced it together from Edmund's calendar and from conversations with his physician's office, is that his heart condition had in fact been more serious than either of us understood in those final weeks before my accident, serious enough that his cardiologist had already begun discussing a more aggressive medication regimen, the very regimen that would later be increased and adjusted in the days surrounding the signing of that second will. Edmund was, in other words, already a man under significant physical strain in the weeks before I ever lost consciousness, a man whose judgment and clarity were already being quietly tested by his own failing body, long before anyone handed him a document to sign. I share this not to excuse what came after, but because I think it matters to understand that Vanessa did not manufacture Edmund's vulnerability from nothing. She recognized an existing vulnerability, one that had been building for months, and she made a choice again and again over a period of weeks, to use it rather than to protect him from it. The accident happened on a Thursday evening in early July, on a stretch of coastal highway I had driven 1,000 times before. Rain had come in fast off the water, the kind of sudden coastal storm that turns asphalt into glass in a matter of minutes. I remember the headlights of the truck crossing the center line. I remember the sound before I remember the pain, a sound like the whole world folding in on itself. I do not remember anything after that for 8 months. My body remembers apparently in the way bodies do. The surgeons told Edmund and later told me that I had suffered a traumatic brain injury severe enough that they could not promise I would ever wake up. And if I did, they could not promise who I would be when I did. Edmund sat beside that hospital bed every day for the first 6 weeks. The nurses told me that much at least before they stopped telling me anything else. What none of them could have predicted was that Edmund's own heart, strained for years by a condition he had kept quiet even from me, would give out 3 weeks after my accident, in the parking garage of the very hospital where I lay unconscious 2 floors above him. He died alone beside our car on a Tuesday evening in late July, while I slept through the single worst night of both our lives without knowing it had happened. I did not learn this for 8 more months. I woke up a widow and did not know it. I woke up cut out of a will and did not know that either. And the woman who made sure I did not know it for as long as possible was the same woman who had once called me, at her college graduation, the only mother she had ever really needed. The 3 days after I regained consciousness were a blur of tests, of relearning how to hold a spoon, of a physical therapist named Renata who spoke to me the way you speak to a child taking her first steps, gently, patiently, without giving anything away. My daughter Sophie was the one who finally told me the truth, and she told me because a nurse let it slip that my husband's memorial service had already been paid for and completed, and Sophie could not, in good conscience, let me hear that secondhand from a stranger changing my 4-bag. She sat on the edge of my hospital bed, held both of my hands in hers, and said the words as gently as words like that can ever be said. "Your father is gone, Mom. He died 3 weeks after your accident. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry no one told you sooner." I do not have adequate words for what it feels like to grieve a death that happened 8 months in the past, to feel the shock of fresh loss for news that is, to everyone else in the room, already old and settled. The world had moved on without me in every sense. Edmund had been buried in a cemetery I had never visited. His obituary had run in 3 newspapers I never read. His company, the company I had helped build from nothing, had already been through a round of leadership changes I knew nothing about. And when Sophie finally worked up the courage to tell me the second piece of news, the piece about the will, I understood for the first time that my accident had not simply taken 8 months from me. It had been used by someone as an opportunity. Sophie explained it to me haltingly, still trying to protect me even as she delivered the blow, the way you try to soften a fall you know is already happening. 3 weeks before Edmund's death, while I lay unconscious and his own heart was already failing in ways he had not disclosed to his doctors, he had gone to his longtime attorney and signed a new will. The old will, the one we had drafted together 15 years earlier, split our estate cleanly between Sophie and Vanessa, with a substantial trust reserved for me regardless of which of us outlived the other, and full ownership of the company held jointly until a transition could be planned properly. The new will, signed in a private meeting that Sophie was not invited to and that I could obviously not attend, removed my name entirely. Every reference to a spousal trust gone. Every joint ownership clause regarding Pierce Architectural Group gone. In their place was language granting Vanessa immediate and controlling interest in the firm, with Sophie receiving a modest cash sum and no seat on the board, and me, Edmund's wife of 31 years, receiving nothing at all beyond a small life insurance payout that had already, I would soon learn, been redirected into a trust Vanessa herself controlled, on the grounds that I was, in the language of the document, incapacitated and unlikely to require independent management of funds. I asked Sophie, my throat still raw from the ventilator tube, how this was possible. How does a man change 3 decades of shared intention in a single afternoon, without his wife's knowledge, while that wife lies unconscious in a hospital bed 2 floors above the very office where the papers were signed? Sophie did not have an answer, not then. What she did have was a folder, printed from documents she had obtained through the estate attorney's office, documents that raised more questions than they answered. The signature on the new will looked like Edmund's, but shakier than I remembered his handwriting ever being, even under stress. The witnesses listed were not our longtime family friends, the ones who had witnessed every important document of our marriage, but 2 employees of the attorney's office I had never met. And the date on the will placed its signing just 4 days after Edmund had been prescribed a new and powerful medication for his heart condition, a medication with well-documented side effects including confusion, memory lapses, and impaired judgment, side effects I would only learn about later, from a source I never expected. It took me nearly 6 more weeks in that rehabilitation facility before I was strong enough to leave under my own power, and every one of those weeks, I lay awake at night turning the same questions over in my mind like stones I could not stop touching. Why had Vanessa never once visited me during those weeks of recovery, despite living only 40 minutes away? Why had she instructed the facility's front desk, according to a records request Sophie later filed, that visitor information regarding my condition should be routed through her office rather than shared directly with hospital staff, effectively making herself the gatekeeper of my own medical updates? And most of all, why, when I finally called the number I still had for our family attorney, Harold Benton, a man who had handled our affairs for over 20 years, did his assistant tell me, in a voice trained to sound apologetic while revealing nothing, that Mr. Benton was unable to discuss estate matters with me directly, and that all further correspondence should be directed to Vanessa's own legal counsel.
I want to be honest with you about what that moment did to me, because I think it is the moment that changed the entire shape of what came next. Up until that phone call, some small, stubborn part of me had still been telling myself there was a reasonable explanation. Grief makes people behave strangely. Edmund's death had clearly been sudden and devastating for everyone. Perhaps Vanessa had simply been overwhelmed, had made decisions in a fog of loss that she would come to regret and correct once I was back on my feet. That phone call ended that particular fiction for good. A woman does not route her comatose stepmother's medical updates through her own office, and does not instruct a family attorney of 20 years to stop speaking to that stepmother directly, out of grief. She does that out of strategy. And strategy requires a plan, executed over time, by someone who understood exactly what she was doing and exactly what she stood to gain from doing it. I was discharged from the rehabilitation facility on a gray Wednesday morning in late October, nearly 9 months after the accident that started all of this. Sophie drove me, because I still could not be trusted behind the wheel, and because there was, quite literally, nowhere else for me to go. I asked her to drive me home, to the house on Larkspur Hill that Edmund and I had built together 15 years into our marriage, the house where I had planted every tree in the front garden with my own hands, where our daughter had grown up, where 31 Christmas mornings had happened in the same living room with the same fireplace. Sophie went quiet in a way that told me, before she said a single word, that something else was wrong. She had tried, she told me, to get inside the house 2 weeks earlier to collect some of my things, clothes, my grandmother's jewelry box, a few photographs, and had found the locks changed. The security code did not work. And when she called the number listed for the property's alarm monitoring company, she was informed that the account had been transferred to a new primary contact 3 months prior, a woman named Vanessa Pierceholt. I sat in the passenger seat of my daughter's car outside the gates of my own home for nearly 20 minutes before I could make myself speak again. The gate itself, wrought iron that Edmund had commissioned from a local ironworker as an anniversary gift, still bore the small brass P we had installed together, Pierce, our family name, and beyond it I could see the house exactly as I had left it the morning of the accident, the same curtains, the same porch light, except now it belonged, in every practical and legal sense, to someone else, and I was standing outside it like a stranger asking permission to enter a home I had built with 3 decades of my own life. I did not cry in that moment, though I have cried plenty of times since, remembering it. What I felt instead was something colder and more useful than grief. I felt the specific, focused clarity of a woman who has just understood, completely and without illusion, that she is at war, and that the person she is at war with has already had 8 months to prepare the battlefield while she slept. Sophie took me to her small apartment that night, and it was there, over tea neither of us drank, that she told me the rest of what she had pieced together during the months I was unreachable. Vanessa's husband, Gregory Holt, had lost a significant amount of money over the preceding 2 years in a series of failed real estate ventures on the other side of the state, ventures that had left the couple, according to court filings Sophie had found through public record searches, more than $800,000 in debt to at least 3 different creditors, one of whom had already filed a lien against a property they still owned. Vanessa herself had been quietly attending board meetings at Pierce Architectural Group in the 2 months before Edmund's death, meetings she had never previously shown any interest in, positioning herself, in retrospect, exactly where she would need to be once control of the firm changed hands. None of it, taken piece by piece, would have proven anything in a courtroom. Taken together, it painted a picture I could no longer pretend not to see. I made a decision that night, sitting on my daughter's second-hand sofa with a cooling mug of tea in my shaking hands, that I have not once regretted since, no matter how difficult the months that followed would prove to be. I decided that I would not simply accept the story that had been written for me while I was unconscious. I had spent 8 months as a passive object in other people's decisions, a body in a bed, a signature line left conveniently blank, a wife whose absence had been treated by at least one person as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. I was awake now. I could hold a pen again, however unsteadily. I could remember, in fragments that grew clearer every week, the exact terms of the will Edmund and I had drafted together, the conversations we had had about what would happen to the company, to Sophie, to me, if either of us could no longer speak for ourselves. And I intended to find every piece of evidence I would need to prove, in a court of law if necessary, that the will presented to the county probate office 4 days after my husband's new heart medication was prescribed did not reflect the man I had married, and did not reflect his true wishes. Before I made a single phone call about the will, I did something I needed to do first, something no attorney could help me with. I asked Sophie to drive me to the cemetery where Edmund was buried, a place I had never seen, on a plot he and I had chosen together years earlier for a future neither of us imagined would arrive this way. I remember the particular quality of that silence, standing over a headstone with his name and dates carved into granite, a stone that had already weathered 8 months of rain and sun without me there to see it happen. I told him things that afternoon I had never had the chance to say, about the accident, about waking up alone, about everything I had learned in the week since. I do not know if grief like that ever fully resolves itself. I know only that I left that cemetery with something I had not carried in when I arrived, a kind of settled resolve that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the plain, simple fact that Edmund deserved to have his actual wishes honored, and that I was, whether I felt ready for the task or not, the only person left who could make sure that happened. That same week, an old friend of mine named Diane Ashcroft tracked down my new phone number through a mutual acquaintance and called me in tears, apologizing for something I did not even know had happened. Diane and I had been close for over 20 years, the kind of friendship built on decades of birthdays and small crises and long phone calls about nothing in particular. She told me she had tried, 3 separate times during my hospitalization, to visit me, and had been told on each occasion by staff at the rehabilitation facility that my family had requested limited visitors during a sensitive recovery period, and that she should direct any questions about my condition to a contact number that turned out to belong to Vanessa's office. Diane had assumed, reasonably, that this restriction had come from me, or from Sophie, some medically necessary precaution during a fragile recovery. She had no way of knowing that it had, in fact, come from someone with a very different set of motivations, someone who understood that isolation is one of the simplest and most effective tools available to a person trying to control a narrative before the person at the center of it can object. Hearing this from Diane confirmed something I had already begun to suspect but had not yet allowed myself to fully accept, which was that my isolation during those recovery months had not been incidental. It had been managed, deliberately, by someone who benefited directly from my remaining confused, unreachable, and unaware for as long as possible. I began, after that call, to reach out systematically to everyone I could remember who might have tried to see me or speak with me during that period, and the pattern that emerged was consistent and unmistakable. Neighbors who had brought food to the house found it left unanswered at a door with the locks already changed. My sister-in-law from my own side of the family, who lived 2 states away, told me she had called the hospital repeatedly and been told, incorrectly, that I had already been discharged to a private facility whose name the hospital could not disclose. Piece by piece, I began to understand that I had not simply slipped through the cracks of an overwhelmed family during a crisis. I had been quietly, methodically walled off from nearly everyone who might have asked an inconvenient question on my behalf. The first person I called about the will itself was not a lawyer. It was Priya Nandi, a home health aide who had spent 3 weeks with Edmund during the period between my accident and his death, hired through an agency to help manage his medications and monitor his condition while he split his time between visiting me at the hospital and managing the sudden chaos of running a company alone. I found her name in a stack of receipts Sophie had kept, receipts Edmund had apparently insisted on paying in cash rather than through the household account, a small detail that would later matter more than I could have guessed. When I finally reached Priya by phone, 3 weeks after my discharge, there was a long silence on the other end of the line before she spoke, the kind of silence that told me she had been waiting for someone to ask her the right question for a very long time. Priya told me, carefully and in a voice that shook slightly with what I now recognize as relief at finally being able to speak, that during the final 2 weeks of her assignment with Edmund, she had grown increasingly concerned about his mental clarity. He forgot appointments he had confirmed only hours earlier. He asked her the same questions about my condition 3 and 4 times in a single afternoon, each time as though hearing the answer for the first time. On one occasion, she told me, she had walked into the study to find him staring at a legal document he did not appear to recognize, asking her, with genuine confusion in his voice, whether she knew what it was and why it had his signature on it. She had reported these concerns, she said, to the one family member who regularly checked in on Edmund's care during that period. That family member was Vanessa. And according to Priya, rather than acting on those concerns, rather than delaying any legal or financial decisions until Edmund's medication could be adjusted or his cognition properly evaluated, Vanessa had thanked her for the update and, 3 days later, driven Edmund herself to a meeting at Harold Benton's office. Priya was not the only person from Edmund's final weeks who eventually came forward. Marion Delacroix, Edmund's executive assistant of nearly 15 years, reached out to Sophie directly after hearing through mutual colleagues at Pierce Architectural Group that questions were being raised about the circumstances of the will. Marion had managed Edmund's calendar for over a decade, and she told us, when we finally sat down with her in her small office on the 3rd floor of the firm's headquarters, that she had never once, in 15 years, seen Edmund schedule a meeting with Harold Benton without personally calling Marion first to have her block the time and prepare whatever documents he wanted brought along. The meeting at which the new will was signed had never come through Marion at all. It had appeared directly on Edmund's calendar, added, she confirmed after checking the system's edit history at our request, from a device logged in under Edmund's account but connected to an IP address that matched Vanessa's home internet service, a detail so specific and so damning that even Miriam, when we brought it to her, allowed herself a rare, small smile of satisfaction. Marion also told us something that had never appeared in any document, something she had simply observed with her own eyes and carried quietly ever since, uncertain what to do with it. In the days immediately following that meeting at Harold Benton's office, she recalled Edmund returning to work looking, in her words, gray and distracted, unlike himself in a way she had chalked up at the time to the stress of my accident. He had asked her, twice within the same week, whether she remembered him mentioning any changes to his estate plans, a question Marion found strange enough to note privately but not strange enough, at the time, to raise with anyone else. She had no way of knowing, in that moment, that she was witnessing the after-effects of exactly the kind of impaired memory his cardiologist would later confirm was a documented risk of his new medication. She only knew that something about her employer of 15 years seemed subtly, persistently wrong, and that no one around him at the time seemed to be asking why. Miriam brought in an independent forensic document examiner as well, a quiet, methodical man named Walter Freeman who had spent 30 years analyzing signatures for exactly this kind of dispute. Walter compared the signature on the contested will against 11 other documents Edmund had signed in the 6 months prior to my accident, when his health was still comparatively stable, and against 3 documents signed in the 2 weeks immediately following the will, including a company purchase order Marion had helped him process. His written report concluded that the signature on the will showed measurable inconsistencies in pressure, stroke consistency, and letter formation compared to Edmund's established baseline. Inconsistencies Walter testified were, in his professional opinion, consistent with a signature produced under conditions of physical fatigue, medication effect, or diminished fine motor control, though he was careful, under cross-examination, to note that inconsistency alone could not prove incapacity on its own. It was, as Miriam had told me from the very beginning, never going to be a single piece of evidence that won this case. It was going to be the accumulated weight of many small, honest observations, each one insufficient by itself, together forming a picture no reasonable person could continue to ignore. I want to pause here and tell you something I have come to believe with absolute certainty over the course of everything that followed. The people who do this kind of harm rarely see themselves as villains. Vanessa did not, I believe, wake up one morning and decide to destroy her father's marriage and steal his wife's inheritance out of simple greed. I think she told herself a story in which she was the responsible one, the one managing a crisis while everyone else fell apart, the one making hard decisions that needed making. I think she convinced herself, somewhere along the way, that she deserved what she was taking, that 31 years of my presence in that family had always been somehow provisional, somehow less permanent than her own blood connection to her father. That story, whatever shape it took in her mind, does not change what she did. It does not change the fact that she watched a man's cognition visibly deteriorate and chose, instead of protecting him, to walk him into a lawyer's office while the window was open. Priya agreed, after some hesitation and after I promised her, truthfully, that I intended to pursue this through legal channels rather than through any confrontation that could put her in a difficult position, to write down everything she remembered and to keep the receipts and her own handwritten notes from that period, notes she had, thankfully, never thrown away. It is a strange thing, to feel gratitude toward a stranger for simply telling the truth. But I felt it that day, and I feel it still. Priya Nandi did not owe me anything. She had been paid to do a job and the job had ended. She chose to speak anyway, because some part of her had known, even at the time, that something was wrong, and she had been waiting for someone to finally ask. The next call I made was to an attorney, though not to Harold Benton, whose loyalty had already been made clear to me by his own assistant's careful, evasive phrasing. Sophie had done research during the weeks I was still recovering, and she handed me a short list of estate litigation attorneys with experience specifically in cases involving undue influence and testamentary capacity, legal terms I did not yet fully understand but would soon come to know intimately. The name at the top of that list belonged to a woman named Miriam Cross, a partner at a mid-sized firm 2 hours from where I now lived, who had built a reputation over 20 years for taking on exactly the kind of case I was about to bring to her, cases where a vulnerable person had been separated, deliberately or not, from the people who might have protected their true intentions before it was too late. I remember very little about the drive to Miriam Cross's office, only that my hands would not stop trembling on the folder of documents Sophie had assembled, and that I rehearsed, silently, over and over, how I would explain a situation that still sounded, even to my own ears, like something out of a novel rather than something that had happened to me. Miriam listened to the entire story without interrupting once, her pen moving steadily across a legal pad, and when I finished, she set the pen down, folded her hands, and told me something I have carried with me ever since. She said that in her experience, the families who commit this particular kind of harm nearly always leave a trail, because the very speed and secrecy required to exploit a narrow window of opportunity tends to produce exactly the kind of documentation that later proves the exploitation occurred. People in a hurry make mistakes. People who believe they will never be questioned rarely bother covering their tracks as carefully as they should. Miriam explained the legal path ahead of me in terms I could actually understand, and I will share the shape of it with you now, because I think it matters that you understand what it actually takes to fight this kind of battle, rather than assuming it happens the way it does in movies, with a single dramatic reveal in a courtroom. Contesting a will on the grounds of undue influence and diminished testamentary capacity required us to prove several things simultaneously. First, that Edmund's medical condition and medication at the time of signing genuinely impaired his ability to understand the document he was signing. Second, that Vanessa had both the opportunity and the motive to exert influence over that decision. Third, and often hardest to prove, that the resulting will did not reflect what Edmund would have wanted had he been of sound mind, which meant establishing, through prior documents, correspondence, and witness testimony, what his actual long-held intentions had been. It would not be fast. It would not be simple. And it would require me to relive, in exhausting detail, both the best years of my marriage and the worst months of my life, in front of judges, opposing counsel, and eventually, if it came to that, a courtroom full of strangers. The road to trial was not a straight one, and I think it would be dishonest of me to tell this story as though every month brought steady progress toward an inevitable conclusion. There was a period, roughly 4 months into the proceedings, when Vanessa's attorneys filed a counter-motion that frightened me more than anything else in the entire ordeal, a motion requesting that the court appoint an independent guardian to oversee my financial and legal affairs, on the grounds that my traumatic brain injury raised legitimate questions about my own current capacity to manage an estate of this size or to reliably testify about events and intentions from more than a year in the past. I remember reading that filing in Miriam's office and feeling something close to panic rise in my chest, a fear that the very vulnerability I had survived might now be used as a weapon to silence me a second time, in a different courtroom, by a different set of lawyers, but toward exactly the same end. Miriam did not panic, and watching her respond to that motion taught me something about how these battles are actually won. She immediately arranged for a full neuropsychological evaluation, conducted by an independent specialist with no connection to either side of the case, an evaluation that took the better part of 2 full days and tested everything from my memory and executive function to my capacity for complex financial reasoning. I will not pretend those 2 days were easy. There is a particular kind of exhausting vulnerability in having your own mind examined and scored by a stranger, knowing that the outcome could determine whether you are permitted to keep speaking for yourself in your own life. The results, when they came back 3 weeks later, were unambiguous. My cognitive function had returned, in every measurable category, to a range consistent with full and independent capacity, a finding the specialist attributed to the considerable success of my physical and cognitive rehabilitation over the preceding year. The guardianship motion was denied within days of that report being filed, and Miriam told me afterward, with characteristic bluntness, that she believed the motion had never been filed in good faith to begin with, that it had been a pressure tactic, an attempt to exhaust me financially and emotionally into abandoning the case before it ever reached a jury. That period tested me in ways the earlier discoveries had not. It is one thing to be angry on behalf of your late husband, to fight for the honoring of his true wishes. It is another thing entirely to sit in a waiting room while a stranger with a clipboard decides whether you are still permitted to be considered the author of your own life. I called Sophie the night before that evaluation began, unable to sleep, and she reminded me of something I have held on to ever since. She told me that the fact they were trying this hard to make me doubt myself was, in its own way, proof of how much they were afraid of what I might prove if I stayed the course. People do not spend this much money and this much effort trying to silence someone they believe has nothing real to say. I told Miriam I was ready. I want to be honest and tell you that I did not entirely believe myself in that moment, but I said it anyway, because some decisions have to be made before you feel ready for them, or you will never make them at all. Miriam filed the initial petition to contest the will within 2 weeks, formally challenging its validity in the county probate court and requesting, as a first step, a freeze on any further transfer or sale of estate assets until the matter could be resolved. It was that filing, more than anything else, that finally provoked a response from Vanessa herself, the first direct communication I had received from her since before my accident. It came not as a phone call or a visit, but as a letter from her own attorney, informing me that my claims were, in the letter's words, an understandable but ultimately misguided attempt to relitigate grief, and that Vanessa hoped I would find peace without dragging our family's private matters through the courts. I remember reading that letter twice, and then a third time, sitting at my daughter's kitchen table with the afternoon light slanting through a window that was not my own window, in a home that was not my own home. Relitigating grief. As though I were a confused old woman who had simply misremembered the terms of my own marriage, rather than a woman who had watched a document appear from nowhere, for days after a medication change, witnessed by 2 people I had never met, while I lay unconscious 2 floors above the room where it was signed. I did not respond to the letter directly. I gave it to Miriam instead, and Miriam smiled in a way that told me she had seen letters like this before, and that in her experience, they were rarely a sign of confidence. People who believe they are on solid legal ground do not typically lead with an appeal to your emotions. They lead with facts. Vanessa's attorney had led with feelings, and Miriam took that, correctly, as an early sign of exactly how thin the ground beneath their position actually was. The discovery process, as it turned out, was where the real story began to surface, piece by piece, in a way that no single dramatic confrontation could have accomplished on its own. Miriam subpoenaed Edmund's complete medical records from the 6 weeks surrounding the signing of the new will, records that had never been shared with me or with Sophie during the initial estate proceedings. Those records confirmed exactly what Priya Nandi had described from her own observations. Edmund's cardiologist had prescribed a new medication 4 days before the will was signed, a medication whose documented side effects included, in the exact clinical language of the prescribing notes, transient confusion, impaired short-term memory, and reduced capacity for complex decision-making in a minority of patients, particularly those over 60, which Edmund was. More damning still, a follow-up appointment scheduled for the week after the will was signed showed that Edmund's own physician had grown concerned enough about his mental clarity during a routine check-in to recommend a cognitive evaluation, an evaluation that never took place, because Edmund died of cardiac arrest 4 days before it was scheduled to occur. Miriam also subpoenaed the internal records of Harold Benton's law office, records that Benton fought, unsuccessfully, to keep sealed, citing attorney-client privilege that Miriam successfully argued did not extend to protect evidence relevant to a claim of undue influence and impaired capacity. What those records revealed changed the entire trajectory of the case. The meeting at which Edmund signed the new will had not been scheduled by Edmund himself. It had been scheduled by Vanessa, using her father's email account, to which she apparently had access through a shared family calendar system Edmund had never fully understood how to manage on his own, a small, ordinary intimacy of trust that she had turned, deliberately or not, into an instrument. The 2 witnesses to the signing, employees of Benton's office, had both noted in brief internal memos, standard practice for the firm in cases involving elderly or ill clients, that the client seemed, in the words of one memo, a little tired but otherwise fine. A phrase that Miriam would later argue, quite persuasively, was precisely the kind of casual, insufficient observation that a genuine capacity evaluation would never have accepted as adequate. Not every part of that discovery process moved forward without resistance. At one point, roughly 7 months into the proceedings, Miriam informed me that Priya Nandi had called her office, visibly shaken, to report that she had received a phone call from an unfamiliar number, a man identifying himself only as representing the family, who suggested to her, in carefully vague but unmistakable terms, that her ongoing cooperation with our case might affect her standing with the home health agency that employed her, an agency that, we would later learn, had a long-standing contract to provide staffing for several properties connected to Vanessa's extended social circle. Miriam took the call seriously enough to file a formal complaint with the court, documenting what she characterized as an attempt at witness intimidation, and while nothing was ever definitively proven to trace back to Vanessa herself, the judge overseeing the case issued a stern warning to both sides regarding any further contact with witnesses outside of formal legal channels. Priya continued cooperating regardless, and told me afterward, with a steadiness I admired deeply, that she had not spent 3 weeks watching a good man's mind slip away from him just to be frightened into silence by an anonymous phone call. Around that same time, I learned something else that added a fresh, quieter layer of grief to everything I was already carrying. Several of Pierce Architectural Group's longtime clients, people Edmund and I had worked with personally for 15 or 20 years, told Denise, once she felt safe enough to reach out to them again, that they had been informed, sometime after Edmund's death, that I had suffered permanent and severe cognitive impairment and would not be returning to any involvement with the firm, an account that was, at the time it was given to them, simply untrue. A few of these clients had sent flowers to what they believed was a long-term care facility, flowers that, as far as I could ever determine, were never actually delivered to me at all. I do not know whether this particular story was told out of genuine, mistaken belief or deliberate convenience, and by the time I learned about it, I found I no longer had the emotional energy to investigate every individual thread of what had been said about me during those months. I simply began, patiently, one relationship at a time, the work of letting people see for themselves that the story they had been told was no longer, and perhaps had never entirely been, true. I want to tell you about the day I finally sat across a deposition table from Vanessa herself, because it is a memory I return to often, not with anger anymore, though anger was certainly present in the room that day, but with something closer to sorrow for what our family had become. She looked older than I remembered, though it had only been a little over a year, and there was a tightness around her eyes that told me, whether she would ever admit it or not, that some part of her understood exactly how thin her position had grown. Miriam's questions were precise, unhurried, and utterly relentless. Why had Vanessa scheduled the meeting with Harold Benton rather than allowing Edmund to schedule it himself, as he had scheduled every prior legal appointment throughout their 31-year marriage? Why had she told Priya Nandi's reported concerns to no one else in the family, not to Sophie, not to Edmund's own physician? Why had the alarm system on the Larkspur Hill property been transferred into her name a full 6 weeks before Edmund's death, while I was still hospitalized and Edmund was, according to his own physician's notes, growing visibly less clear in his thinking? Vanessa's answers, over the course of that 4-hour deposition, grew progressively less steady, and I watched, with an ache I had not expected, as the careful narrative she and her attorney had constructed began to fray at its seams under the simple, patient pressure of specific questions asked in exact chronological order. She claimed, at first, that she had simply been trying to help her father manage an overwhelming period of his life, a claim that might even have been partly true, in the way that the most damaging betrayals are often built on a foundation of genuine and then corrupted intention. But when Miriam produced the timeline, laid out in black and white, of the alarm system transfer, the calendar access, the scheduled meeting, the medication change, and the follow-up appointment that never happened because Edmund died before it could, the word helping began to sound, even to Vanessa's own ears, I believe, like something closer to its opposite. There is a particular moment from that deposition I have thought about more than any other, and I share it with you now because I think it says more about what happened to our family than any legal document ever could. Miriam asked Vanessa directly whether she had ever discussed with her father, prior to the meeting with Harold Benton, what changes he actually wanted made to his estate plan, or whether the specific terms of the new will, the removal of my spousal trust, the transfer of controlling company interest to Vanessa herself, had originated with Edmund at all. Vanessa was silent for nearly 30 seconds, a silence that stretched long enough that even her own attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat, before she finally said that her father had trusted her to handle things, and that she had done what she believed was best for the family during an impossible time. She never actually answered the question. She never claimed, under oath, that the specific terms of that will had come from Edmund himself. And in a deposition, in the eyes of an attorney like Miriam Cross, what a person carefully avoids saying can matter every bit as much as what they finally do say. While the legal process ground forward through the following months, I was also, slowly and imperfectly, rebuilding the parts of my life that had nothing to do with courtrooms at all. I moved out of Sophie's small apartment and into a modest rental 2 streets away, small enough that I could manage it on my own even as my balance and stamina continued to improve week by week under Renata's patient physical therapy. I reconnected with old friends who had, I learned, tried repeatedly to visit me during my hospitalization and had been turned away or redirected by staff following instructions I would later confirm had come from Vanessa's office. I began, cautiously, to trust my own memory again, memory that had felt so unreliable in those first disorienting weeks after waking, and found that the more evidence Miriam uncovered, the more my own recollections of Edmund, of our marriage, of the life we had built together, sharpened back into focus, as though the truth itself had a kind of gravity that pulled scattered fragments back into their proper shape. There were harder days during that period than I have fully described, days when the physical work of recovery collided with the emotional weight of everything I was learning, and left me too exhausted to do either well. I remember one afternoon in particular, roughly 5 months after my discharge, when I collapsed in frustration during a physical therapy session, unable to complete a simple balance exercise I had managed easily the week before, my legs simply refusing to cooperate no matter how hard I concentrated. Renata did not rush me that day. She sat down on the mat beside me, let me catch my breath, and told me something I have thought about often since, that healing is never a straight line, that some days the body simply needs to rest even when the mind is desperate to keep moving forward, and that the two kinds of recovery I was managing, the physical and the legal, did not always keep pace with one another, and did not need to. I went home that evening and allowed myself, for the first time since waking from the coma, to simply grieve without also strategizing, to miss Edmund without immediately turning that grief into fuel for the fight ahead. It was, strangely, one of the most useful days of the entire process, because it reminded me that I was allowed to be a woman who had lost her husband, not only a woman building a legal case. Our wedding anniversary fell that same autumn, our 32nd, though of course there was no one left to celebrate it with in the way we always had, a quiet dinner at the same small restaurant where Edmund had proposed, a tradition we had kept without fail for 3 decades. I drove there anyway, alone, and asked for a table for one, and the owner, an older man named Theo who had known us both for 25 years, recognized me the moment I walked through the door. He did not say anything about Edmund, did not offer the kind of careful, sorrowful condolences I had grown so tired of receiving from well-meaning strangers. He simply seated me at our usual table by the window, brought out, unprompted, the same bottle of wine Edmund always ordered, and told me that the table would always be waiting for me, whenever I wanted it, for however many years I needed to keep coming. I sat there for nearly 2 hours that evening, and I will tell you honestly that I cried through most of it, but it was a different kind of crying than the anger and fear that had carried me through most of that year. It was simply grief, allowed to exist on its own terms for one evening, without a single document or deposition attached to it, and I think, looking back, that evening did as much to prepare me for the trial ahead as any conversation I ever had with Miriam. Sophie, for her part, had her own reckoning to make during this period, one I did not fully understand until much later. She told me, one evening over dinner in my small new kitchen, that in the immediate aftermath of Edmund's death, while I was still unconscious and unreachable, Vanessa had told her, gently and with what had seemed at the time like genuine compassion, that I would likely never wake up, or if I did, that the doctors expected significant permanent impairment, and that the kindest thing the family could do was to make practical arrangements now rather than burden a woman who might never again be capable of managing her own affairs. Sophie had believed this, because she had no reason not to, and because grief makes people accept the explanations that require the least additional pain in a moment already overflowing with it. It was only months later, once I had woken up clear-eyed and increasingly capable, that Sophie began to understand how thoroughly she, too, had been managed, not through outright lies necessarily, but through the careful, selective framing of uncertainty into inevitability. I do not blame my daughter for believing what she was told during the worst weeks of her life. I have made a point, throughout everything that has happened since, of separating the people who were deceived from the person who did the deceiving, because I believe that distinction matters, both legally and morally, and because I have watched too many families destroy themselves further by failing to make it. Sophie was a grieving daughter handed a narrative by a sister she had no particular reason to distrust. She was not the one who scheduled a legal meeting using her unconscious stepmother's husband's compromised email access. She was not the one who transferred an alarm system into her own name while her father's cognition visibly declined. Sophie's failure, if it can even be called that, was the ordinary failure of trusting a family member during a crisis. Vanessa's failure was something else entirely, something with intention behind it, something that required active choices made and remade over a period of weeks, each one moving the outcome further in a single, self-interested direction. The company itself, Pierce Architectural Group, became its own battleground during this period, separate from but deeply entangled with the will contest itself. Under the terms of the new will, Vanessa had assumed controlling interest and, within 2 months of Edmund's death, had installed Gregory, her husband with the $800,000 in undisclosed debt, as the firm's new chief financial officer, a position he had no relevant prior experience to justify. Employees who had worked alongside Edmund and me for over a decade began quietly reaching out to Sophie, and eventually to me, describing a workplace transformed almost overnight, budgets reallocated in ways that made little architectural sense but made a great deal of sense if you understood that Gregory's creditors were owed specific amounts by specific dates. One senior project manager, a woman named Denise Okafor who had been with the firm for 18 years, resigned rather than continue watching what she described to me, in a phone call I will never forget, as the slow, deliberate hollowing out of a company Edmund had spent his life building, carried out by people who understood nothing about architecture and everything about extraction. Denise's resignation, and the detailed letter she sent to the firm's board explaining her reasons for it, became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case, because it established, through the testimony of someone with no personal stake in the family dispute, that Vanessa and Gregory's management of the company following Edmund's death had deviated sharply and specifically from decades of established practice, in ways that primarily benefited Gregory's outside financial obligations rather than the health of the firm itself. Miriam argued, and would later argue before a judge, that this pattern of post-death financial behavior was itself circumstantial evidence supporting the broader claim of undue influence, because it demonstrated a clear and specific motive, not an abstract one, for why Vanessa might have wanted uncontested control of the estate secured as quickly and quietly as possible, before I ever had the chance to wake up and ask a single question. There was one more discovery, made almost by accident nearly a year into the legal proceedings, that I believe finally tipped the entire case in a direction from which Vanessa's attorneys could no longer recover. Sophie, going through boxes of Edmund's personal effects that had been returned to her from his office after his death, found a sealed envelope tucked inside an old leather portfolio he had used for decades, the same portfolio he had carried to every important meeting of his professional life. Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter, dated just 11 days before my accident, addressed to me. Edmund had never given it to me, and I will never know for certain whether he intended to give it to me on some future anniversary, or whether he simply wrote it as a private act of reflection during a period when, according to friends who spoke to him during those weeks, he had been unusually contemplative about his own mortality. In the letter, in his own unmistakable handwriting, steady and familiar, nothing like the shaking signature on the disputed will, Edmund wrote about our marriage, about the company we had built together, and about his absolute intention, in his own words, that no matter what happened to either of us, the other would always be protected, always have a full and equal voice in whatever came next for Pierce Architectural Group and for our family. I remember the exact moment Sophie handed me that letter, sitting at my kitchen table on a rainy evening, her hands trembling slightly as she passed it across to me, unable to fully explain what she had found before I simply had to read it myself. I recognized his handwriting before I had even finished unfolding the pages, the particular slant of his capital letters, the small, deliberate way he crossed his sevens, a habit from an old drafting class he had taken decades before either of us met. Reading his words, written so shortly before the accident that ended our life as we knew it, felt like hearing his voice again after nearly a year of silence, and I will admit that I could not finish the letter in a single sitting. I set it down twice, walked to the kitchen window, breathed until the tightness in my chest eased enough to continue. He wrote about specific memories from our marriage, the diner where he first sketched the company's original logo on a napkin, the night Sophie was born, a disagreement we had once had over expanding into a second city that had, in hindsight, turned out to be one of the best decisions the firm ever made. And near the end, in a passage Miriam would later describe as the single most important sentence in the entire case, he wrote that if anything ever happened to him, he wanted it understood clearly that Charlotte built this life alongside me, not behind me, and any decision made about our family's future that did not include her voice was not a decision he would ever recognize as his own. Miriam had that letter authenticated by the same forensic document examiner who had analyzed the disputed will's signature, and Walter Freeman confirmed, after careful comparison against a dozen other verified samples of Edmund's handwriting from the same general period, that the letter was, in his professional opinion, genuinely and consistently written in Edmund's own hand, with none of the irregularities that had marked the signature on the will signed 4 months later. That single finding, more than perhaps any other piece of evidence gathered over the course of the entire case, drew the clearest possible line between the man who had written those words with a clear and steady hand, and the man who had signed away his wife's inheritance under circumstances that, by every available account, no longer reflected the same clarity at all. That letter could not, on its own, overturn a legally signed document. Miriam was careful to explain that to me, so that I would not place more weight on it than the law itself would allow. But as evidence of Edmund's genuine, long-standing, and consistently held intentions, expressed in his own hand just 11 days before the accident that started this entire chain of events, and directly contradicted, for months later, by a will signed under circumstances of documented cognitive impairment and undisclosed procedural manipulation, it was, in Miriam's words, exactly the kind of evidence that turns a difficult case into a compelling one. When she read that letter aloud for the first time in a pre-trial hearing, I watched Vanessa's attorney's expression change in real time, and I understood, in that moment, that whatever confidence had carried them this far had just quietly and permanently begun to drain out of the room. The trial itself, when it finally came, lasted 6 days, though it felt, in the way that all consequential things do, both far longer and strangely brief, as though the entire year and a half since I had woken from that coma had been compressed into a single courtroom and handed back to me to relive from the outside. I testified for nearly 2 full days, walking the court through 31 years of marriage, through the accident, through waking up to a locked gate and a stranger's voice on an alarm company's phone line, through every phone call and every document and every quiet, cumulative realization that had led me to this room. I will not pretend it was easy. There were moments on that stand when my voice broke, when I had to stop and ask for a glass of water simply to steady myself before I could continue, and I remember catching Sophie's eyes in the gallery each time, drawing whatever strength I could from the fact that she was there, that she believed me, that whatever damage had been done to our family, this particular thread of it had not been severed. The hardest portion of my testimony came when Vanessa's attorney cross-examined me about my own memory of the months surrounding my accident, a line of questioning clearly designed to plant doubt about how reliable a witness a woman recovering from a traumatic brain injury could truly be. He asked me, repeatedly and from several different angles, whether it was possible that my recollection of conversations with Edmund about the estate, conversations that had taken place years before the accident, might simply be incomplete or reconstructed rather than genuinely remembered. I understood exactly what he was doing, and I understood that the calmest, clearest answer I could give would matter more than any display of indignation. I told him that my memory of the accident itself and the days immediately following it remained genuinely fragmented, and that I would never pretend otherwise under oath. But I told him that my memory of 31 years of marriage, of the specific promises Edmund and I had made to each other about protecting one another no matter what came, was not fragmented at all, because it had been lived and relived and confirmed 1,000 times over 3 decades, long before any accident, and that no single injury, however serious, erases that kind of accumulated truth. I do not know exactly how the jury received that answer, since the case never reached their final verdict, but I watched Miriam's expression as I gave it, and I understood I had said exactly what needed saying. Sophie testified on the second day as well, and I want to tell you honestly that watching my daughter take that stand was, in some ways, harder for me than testifying myself. She spoke about the weeks following Edmund's death with a rawness that surprised even me, describing how Vanessa had gently guided her toward believing my recovery was unlikely, how that belief had shaped every decision Sophie herself had gone along with during those early months, and how it had felt, once she understood the fuller picture, to realize that her own grief had been used as a kind of tool and a strategy she had no idea she was participating in. Under cross-examination, Vanessa's attorney tried to suggest that Sophie's testimony was motivated by a desire to secure a larger inheritance for herself, a suggestion Sophie answered with a steadiness that made me prouder of her than almost anything else in her adult life. She said that she had never once, throughout the entire process, asked Miriam what her own financial recovery might look like under the reinstated will, because this had never been about money for her. It had been about making sure her mother's life was not rewritten by someone else while she was too unconscious to object, and about honoring a father whose own true wishes, expressed in his own handwriting, had been buried alongside him before anyone thought to ask what he actually wanted. Priya Nandi testified on the third day, calm and precise in a way that lent her account an authority no amount of cross-examination could shake. She described, in careful detail, the specific instances of confusion she had witnessed in Edmund during those final weeks, and the conversation in which she had raised those concerns directly with Vanessa, only to watch, 3 days later, as Edmund was driven to sign away the very protections he had spent his life building for the people he loved. Denise Okafor testified about the company's post-death financial patterns. Edmund's cardiologist testified about the medication's documented side effects and the cognitive evaluation that had been scheduled but never completed. And on the final day, Miriam read Edmund's letter into the official record in its entirety, his own words, written in his own hand, describing a marriage and a set of intentions that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the document Vanessa's attorneys had spent 6 days trying to defend. Harold Benton testified on the 4th day, and I watched a man who had handled my family's most private affairs for over 20 years choose his words with the careful precision of someone who understood, finally and completely, that his own professional judgment was now under scrutiny alongside Vanessa's conduct. Under Miriam's questioning, Benton admitted that his standard practice for clients over the age of 60, particularly those with known cardiac conditions, was to request a brief capacity screening from an outside physician before finalizing any significant changes to an existing estate plan, a practice he acknowledged he had not followed in Edmund's case. Asked why, Benton said that Vanessa had assured him the meeting needed to happen quickly, citing Edmund's own stated wish to settle matters of the estate while I remained hospitalized and while, in her words, everyone's mind was already focused on the family's affairs. Miriam asked him plainly whether he had ever spoken to Edmund alone, without Vanessa present, to confirm that this urgency reflected Edmund's own wishes rather than hers. Benton was quiet for a long moment before admitting that he had not. That admission mattered more than almost anything else in the entire trial, because it established, through the testimony of the very attorney who had drafted and witnessed the will, that the standard safeguards meant to protect a client in Edmund's condition had been set aside, and that the pressure to move quickly had come from Vanessa rather than from Edmund himself. Benton would later voluntarily surrender his license to continue practicing estate law while a separate bar association inquiry examined his conduct in the matter, a consequence I take no particular satisfaction in, but one that felt, in its own quiet way, like a necessary piece of the larger accounting that this entire ordeal had demanded of everyone involved. A forensic accountant named Priscilla Nguyen also testified that day, walking the jury through 18 months of Pierce Architectural Group's financial records with the kind of methodical clarity that turns abstract suspicion into concrete fact. She showed, line by line, how funds from 3 separate company accounts had been redirected, through a series of transfers structured to avoid triggering standard audit flags, toward accounts ultimately connected to Gregory Holt's outstanding creditors. The total, by the time of trial, exceeded $400,000, moved over the course of 11 months following Edmund's death, during the exact period when Vanessa held uncontested control of the company under the terms of the disputed will. Priscilla was careful, under cross-examination, to note that she could not testify to intent, only to pattern, but the pattern itself, laid out across a dozen exhibits projected onto a screen in front of the jury, spoke with a clarity that required very little additional interpretation. Vanessa took the stand on the 5th day, and I want to tell you honestly that I felt no triumph watching her there, only a kind of exhausted sadness for what our family had become and for the choices that had brought her to that particular chair, under oath, trying to explain herself to a room full of strangers. Under Miriam's cross-examination, the same gaps that had opened during her deposition months earlier widened further under the additional pressure of a public trial. She could not explain why she had used her father's email access to schedule the meeting with Harold Benton rather than allowing him to schedule it himself, a habit he had maintained without exception for 3 decades. She could not adequately explain why the alarm system had been transferred to her name 6 weeks before his death, during a period when his own physician's notes documented growing concern about his cognitive state. And when Miriam finally asked her, directly and without softening, whether she had genuinely believed, in her heart, that the will she helped orchestrate reflected her father's true and settled wishes, or whether it reflected what she needed it to say, Vanessa's composure finally, completely broke, and she wept on the stand for nearly 10 minutes before the judge called a recess. I want to describe that recess itself for a moment, because the 90 minutes we spent waiting outside that courtroom felt, in some ways, longer than the entire 18 months that had preceded them. Sophie sat beside me on a hard wooden bench in the hallway, gripping my hand the way she had gripped it in the hospital when she first told me Edmund was gone, and neither of us spoke much, both of us simply watching the door, waiting to learn whether a jury of 12 strangers would decide, on our behalf, whether the truth we had spent a year and a half assembling was enough. Miriam came out once during that wait, briefly, just to tell us that these conferences could go either way, that a request for private conference sometimes signaled a losing side looking for a graceful exit, and sometimes signaled nothing more than routine housekeeping before a verdict. I did not find that reassuring in the moment, though I understood, later, that she was simply being honest rather than making promises she could not keep. When Miriam finally emerged and asked to speak with me privately in a small side room, I remember bracing myself for almost anything, certain in that moment that I could handle whatever she was about to tell me because I had already survived so much worse than a single conversation. She told me that Vanessa's attorneys had approached the judge requesting a settlement conference, a clear signal, in Miriam's professional reading of the moment, that they no longer believed a jury verdict would go in their favor, particularly after the forensic accountant's testimony and Harold Benton's admission the day before. She laid out, carefully, exactly what a settlement could offer that a jury verdict might not guarantee: a faster and more certain resolution, full reinstatement of the original will's terms without the additional years of appeals a contested verdict might invite, and closure that would not hinge on the unpredictable sympathies of 12 people who had never met any of us before this week. I asked her, honestly, what she would do in my position. She told me that in her professional opinion, the settlement on the table gave me everything I had actually gone to court to reclaim, and that sometimes the wisest victory is the one that ends the war rather than merely winning the final battle of it. I thought of Edmund's letter, still tucked in a folder in my bag, and I told Miriam I was ready to sign. Before I did, I asked for one thing that had nothing to do with money or property, a request Miriam relayed to the other side almost as an afterthought, uncertain whether it would even be granted. I asked that the settlement include a formal, written acknowledgement, entered into the court record, that the will signed 4 months after my accident had been procured under circumstances that did not reflect Edmund's genuine and independent wishes. I did not need Vanessa's apology. I needed the truth itself to exist somewhere permanent, somewhere beyond memory or family argument, a public record that could never again be quietly rewritten by whoever happened to be holding the pen. That clause was accepted without objection, and when I finally signed my own name to the settlement agreement 2 days later, I felt something settle in my chest that had not settled once in the 18 months since I first woke up in that hospital bed. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter and sturdier than that. Something closer to being believed. I will not describe every detail of what happened during that recess, because some of it belongs to Vanessa and not to this story, but I will tell you that when the court reconvened, her attorney requested a private conference with the judge and with Miriam, and that conference led, within 2 days, to a negotiated settlement rather than a final verdict, though the terms of that settlement made clear, in every practical sense, who the court believed had told the truth. The original will, the one Edmund and I had drafted together 15 years earlier, was reinstated in full. The spousal trust was restored. My ownership stake in Pierce Architectural Group was returned to me in its entirety, along with a formal seat on the board that Vanessa had spent a year and a half denying I had any right to hold. Vanessa retained a reduced inheritance, still substantial, still more than most people will ever see in a lifetime, but no longer the entirety of an estate built by 2 people over 31 years, one of whom had simply been unconscious at the moment someone decided to rewrite the terms of her own life without her. Gregory, it emerged during the final stages of the proceedings, faced a separate and more serious legal reckoning entirely apart from the will contest itself. The financial irregularities Denise Okafor had first flagged in her resignation letter led, once formally investigated by the company's outside auditors, to evidence of funds improperly redirected from Pierce Architectural Group accounts toward Gregory's personal creditors, evidence serious enough that the firm's board, once I had regained my seat on it, voted unanimously to refer the matter to state prosecutors for review of potential embezzlement charges. I do not know, as I record this, exactly how that particular chapter will end, whether it will result in formal charges, a plea agreement, or some other resolution entirely. What I do know is that the man who married into our family, who sat at holiday dinners and called Edmund by his first name, ultimately treated the company Edmund built as a resource to be quietly drained rather than a legacy to be protected, and that his own choices, not mine, are the ones that will determine what happens to him next. My first day back in the Pierce Architectural Group offices came about 6 weeks after the settlement was finalized, and I will admit that I stood outside the building's glass doors for several minutes before I could make myself walk through them. The lobby had been redesigned during the period Vanessa controlled the firm, sleeker and colder than the space Edmund and I had built together, and I remember feeling, absurdly, like a visitor in a place that had once been as familiar to me as my own home. That feeling did not last long. Denise Okafor, who had agreed to return to the firm once I regained my board seat, met me at the elevator with a hug that nearly knocked the wind out of me, and within an hour, a dozen employees I had not seen in nearly 2 years had found reasons to stop by the conference room where the board meeting was being held, just to see, with their own eyes, that I had actually come back. One young architect, hired only 8 months earlier and unaware of most of what had happened, asked me afterward whether I had always worked at the firm, and Denise, laughing for what I think was the first time in over a year, told her that I had not simply worked there. I had helped build the ground it was standing on. It was a small moment, easy to overlook in the larger arc of everything that had happened, but it told me, more clearly than any legal document could, that the truth of who I was and what I had built had never actually disappeared. It had only been temporarily obscured, waiting for the chance to be seen again. There was one more conversation I had with Vanessa, roughly 3 weeks after the settlement was finalized, one that neither our attorneys nor the courts required of either of us. She called me, unannounced, and asked if I would be willing to meet her at a small coffee shop halfway between our 2 homes, neutral ground for a conversation I suspect we both knew was overdue regardless of what the legal proceedings had already decided. I almost said no. I sat with the phone in my hand for the better part of an hour before I called her back and agreed. I went, I think, less because I believed it would change anything material about what had happened, and more because I still remembered a 20-year-old girl at her college graduation, telling me I was the only mother she had ever really needed, and some part of me needed to look the woman she had become in the eyes at least once more before deciding what role, if any, she would continue to play in my life. She did not offer excuses that afternoon, which surprised me more than I expected it to. She told me that in the weeks after my accident, watching her father grow visibly more fragile while I remained unreachable in a hospital bed, she had convinced herself that she was the only person left capable of protecting the family, and that somewhere in that conviction, protecting the family had quietly and gradually become indistinguishable, in her own mind, from protecting herself. She did not ask me to forgive her, not exactly, and I did not offer it, not exactly, though I told her that I no longer wished her harm, which was true, and which felt, in that particular moment, like as much honesty as either of us could reasonably manage. We have spoken twice since, both times briefly, both times civil. I do not know what our relationship will look like 5 years from now. I know only that I have chosen not to let what happened calcify into a permanent and total severing, not because she has earned that grace, but because I decided, somewhere in the middle of the hardest year of my life, that I did not want bitterness to be the final shape of everything Edmund's family became. Sophie and I marked the 1-year anniversary of the settlement with a small gathering at the Larkspur Hill house, the first real celebration held there since before my accident. Denise Okafor came, along with Priya, Marion, and a handful of longtime employees from Pierce Architectural Group who had stayed loyal through the entire ordeal, some of them at real professional cost to themselves. We stood in the garden I had planted with my own hands 15 years earlier, the same trees Sophie had watched grow up alongside her, and I gave a short, unrehearsed toast that I do not remember word for word, except for the last line, which I remember exactly, because I meant every syllable of it. I said that Edmund built this company and this family on the belief that the people you love should never have to fight to be believed, and that the greatest honor any of us could give him now was to make sure that belief outlived every attempt anyone ever made to erase it. I moved back into the house on Larkspur Hill on a cool morning in early spring, almost exactly 2 years after the accident that took me away from it. Sophie came with me, and so did Priya Nandi, who I had, by then, hired in a permanent capacity to help manage the ongoing physical therapy I still occasionally needed, and who had become, somewhere along the way, something closer to a friend than an employee. I stood at that same wrought iron gate, the one with the small brass P that Edmund had commissioned as an anniversary gift, and I let myself cry, finally and completely, for everything the last 2 years had taken from me and for everything they had, against every likelihood, eventually given back. The house looked exactly as I had left it, and also entirely different, the way any place does once you have fought to reclaim it rather than simply inherited it without a second thought. I think often, now, about the 8 months I spent unconscious in that hospital bed, and about how much of what happened to me during that time was decided by people who assumed, correctly in the short term and catastrophically incorrectly in the long term, that I would never wake up to object. I think about how easy it was, in the end, for one determined and self-interested person to reshape 31 years of shared history in the space of a single afternoon, using nothing more than a moment of vulnerability, a shaky signature, and 2 witnesses who never bothered to ask the right questions. And I think, most of all, about how close I came to never knowing any of it, to simply accepting the story I was handed once I finally woke up, tired and grateful just to be alive, willing to believe that grief alone explained every strange silence and every locked door. There is a particular kind of loneliness in surviving something catastrophic only to discover that survival itself has been treated, by someone you trusted, as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a miracle to be celebrated. I have spent a great deal of time since the settlement thinking about how ordinary the individual steps of Vanessa's betrayal actually were, how none of them, taken alone, would strike most people as dramatic or unusual. A visitor list quietly narrowed. A calendar invitation sent from a shared account. A legal meeting scheduled a few days sooner than it might otherwise have been. None of it announces itself as wrongdoing in the moment. That, I have come to believe, is precisely what makes this particular kind of harm so dangerous, and so common, far more common than any of us like to admit at family gatherings where everyone is on their best behavior. It rarely arrives as a single dramatic act of theft. It arrives as 100 small, deniable choices, each one easy to justify individually, that only reveal their true shape once you finally have the strength and the distance to lay them all out together. I also think, often, about how differently this story might have ended if even one of the people who noticed something wrong had stayed silent rather than eventually speaking up. If Priya Nandi had decided her observations were none of her business once her contract ended. If Marion Delacroix had assumed the strange calendar entry was simply none of her concern. If Denise Okafor had quietly accepted the company's new direction rather than resigning and writing down, in detail, exactly why she could no longer be part of it. Each of those people took a risk, however small it might have seemed to them at the time, by choosing honesty over the much easier path of staying out of a family's private business. I do not think any of them fully understood, in the moment, how much their individual honesty would eventually matter. I understand it completely, and I will be grateful to every one of them for the rest of my life. I did not accept that story, and I am telling you all of this tonight because I believe, with everything in me, that you should never accept a story simply because someone tells it to you with confidence, especially not when that story conveniently benefits the person telling it. Ask for the documents. Ask for the timeline. Ask, especially, why someone would rather you stayed confused than informed. The people who have nothing to hide rarely object to questions. It is only the ones with something to protect who tell you, gently and repeatedly, that it would simply be easier for everyone if you let it go. Sophie and I have rebuilt our relationship into something stronger, I think, than it was even before the accident, forged in the particular fire of having fought, together, for the truth when it would have been so much easier to simply accept the comfortable version of events we were both initially handed. Pierce Architectural Group is thriving again, under leadership that actually understands what Edmund and I spent our lives building it to be. And I have kept his letter, the one Sophie found tucked inside that old leather portfolio, in the drawer of the desk where I now sit most mornings, not because I need the reminder of what he wanted for us, but because I like having his own handwriting nearby, steady and unmistakable, proof, whenever I need it, that some things cannot be rewritten no matter how many people try. I woke up in a hospital bed on a Tuesday morning in March, not knowing that my husband was dead, not knowing that my home had been locked against me, not knowing that the people I trusted most had spent 8 months deciding what my life would look like without ever once asking me. I did not stay that woman for long. And if there is one thing I want you to carry with you after hearing this story, it is simply this. Waking up is not the end of the fight. Sometimes it is only the very beginning of it, and the fight is always worth having, for as long as it takes to win it. I did not accept that story, and I am telling you all of this tonight because I believe, with everything in me, that you should never accept a story simply because someone tells it to you with confidence, especially not when that story conveniently benefits the person telling it. Ask for the documents. Ask for the timeline. Ask, especially, why someone would rather you stayed confused than informed. The people who have nothing to hide rarely object to questions. It is only the ones with something to protect who tell you, gently and repeatedly, that it would simply be easier for everyone if you let it go. Sophie and I have rebuilt our relationship into something stronger, I think, than it was even before the accident, forged in the particular fire of having fought, together, for the truth when it would have been so much easier to simply accept the comfortable version of events we were both initially handed. Pierce Architectural Group is thriving again, under leadership that actually understands what Edmund and I spent our lives building it to be. And I have kept his letter, the one Sophie found tucked inside that old leather portfolio, in the drawer of the desk where I now sit most mornings, not because I need the reminder of what he wanted for us, but because I like having his own handwriting nearby, steady and unmistakable, proof, whenever I need it, that some things cannot be rewritten no matter how many people try. I woke up in a hospital bed on a Tuesday morning in March, not knowing that my husband was dead, not knowing that my home had been locked against me, not knowing that the people I trusted most had spent 8 months deciding what my life would look like without ever once asking me. I did not stay that woman for long. And if there is one thing I want you to carry with you after hearing this story, it is simply this. Waking up is not the end of the fight. Sometimes it is only the very beginning of it, and the fight is always worth having, for as long as it takes to win it.